final panel of the day, See It to Be It. This one focuses on portrayal of women's sport and its athletes in the media and the role that media coverage plays in the development of female athletes and women's sport. It's only by understanding and interrogating the key problem areas that we'll be able to address them and to establish what change is needed and how to bring that change about. So knowledge is always power. And that's why the ITF has commissioned this unique research project to accompany this panel today, looking at the portrayal, perception and representation of sportswomen across media and social media. We touched upon the results a little bit earlier with Billie Jean, but I think the most notable results were the difference in language applied to male versus female athletes, a softer and less combative and competitive vocabulary. There was a really clear indication in the analysis of search engine data that the appetite is there for women's sport. So it's just a question of the world finding ways of better meeting that appetite and giving women's sport the platform it deserves. And we couldn't have a better group of panelists debate how to do that today. For today's discussion, we have Victoria Azarenka, a former world number one, year-end number one, holder of 20 WTA singles titles, and a two-time Grand Slam champion and time Olympic medal winner, including a mixed doubles gold at London in 2012. We have Peter Hutton, Director of Sports Partnerships at Facebook. Peter works across all Facebook platforms, including Instagram, WhatsApp Messenger, Oculus, and Facebook itself, and he's previously held senior roles at MP and Silver, Eurosport, Ten Sports, and Fox. Chanda Rubin, a former world number 6 tennis player with 7 WTA titles to her name. She established the Chanda Rubin Foundation, which provides funding for youth play opportunities and scholarships. And she's now also working for Tennis Channel as a presenter and commentator. We've got Annika Sorenstam, often regarded as the best female golfer of all time, having amassed 89 worldwide titles, including 10 majors. She's since become the first and only female golfer to create a successful business brand and has recently been appointed president of the International Golf Federation. And last but by no means least, we have Caroline Weir, a professional footballer for Manchester City and a Scottish international as well, with 2 FA Cups and a League Cup to her name. She works with Girls United and Common Goal, 2 programs with the aim of getting more girls into football, not just playing, but also in coaching and administration. So a really broad range of experience and perspectives today. And I'm really looking forward to getting so many different views on a number of different topics. It's such a privilege to be in your company. And I wanted to start off by touching a little bit on the outcome of that research and to hear one or two of you on your reactions to it, whether you were surprised by any of it or whether it confirmed your lived experience as athletes. Chanda, perhaps you might like to start by talking about your response.
Hi, thank you, Catherine. Hello to everybody on the panel. It is a pleasure for me to be here as well. You know, it was interesting when I looked at the findings of the research, and, you know, there were a number of things I was not surprised by. You know, when you look at how women are talked about, how conversations are around women versus men are athletes first. And in many cases, the media and in general, people having these conversations look to find other interesting things about women, apart from them being athletes. You know, they're looking at, you know, their upbringing, their background, their ethnicity. So, you know, those things we kind of see, and we do want to change the conversation surrounding women athletes and the coverage of men's sports and in tennis in particular. You know, there's always more coverage surrounding men versus women, and we're fighting for that kind of market share because people are interested. I did think it was interesting. I wouldn't say I was so much surprised as I had not thought of it. But the mention of skin color in women's tennis is more prevalent than in men's. I hadn't really thought from that perspective, and also the mentions of Black Lives Matter, you know, 3 times than in men's tennis. And I think part of that is because of maybe some of the women we have at the top of the game, a couple of Black women in Naomi Osaka and Coco Gauff, who are at the forefront of conversation. So I didn't necessarily think that was a negative, but it was interesting for me, a little bit surprising, you know, to learn about that. And I also thought it was interesting when I read that there's a similar level of interest, even though there's more conversation around, men's sport and men's tennis in particular, that there was a similar level of interest in the searches. So, I mean, that tells you that people want to know. And I think, Catherine, you mentioned this in the previous panel, or someone mentioned it, that people are interested, in women's sports and women's tennis. They want to know, they want to follow it, but maybe they're not getting fed enough of it, and it's not enough to satisfy what the appetite is. So I think that is certainly a positive that we can look to change.
There's so much I want to pick up on there, Chandler. That's fascinating. I just wanted to get your perspective on your response to the research, obviously coming from a completely different sport in football.
Yeah, I think I would have to agree that the findings didn't really surprise me. I think in women's football, there's kind of like a fine at the moment between growing the game and encouraging females to take part. But also, I think there's room for a little bit more constructive kind of, not criticism, maybe the wrong word, but just analysis. I see it in the men's game. And I think there is a little bit more room for that in the women's game. So I think with, the TV deal with Sky and BBC that just came through a few weeks ago, hopefully we'll see a little bit more of that, and just the language, talking more about the football and the technical aspects of the game instead of maybe, the female players that are playing. So I would like to see a little bit more of that, I think.
Just picking up on, Chandra, one of the things that you highlighted there about the appetite being there in sport, which is obviously great to hear, but that not being met at the moment, either quantitatively or qualitatively. It needs the media to feed it and to present the sport in a certain way and help shape things. Peter, I wanted to get your view on this. Does that surprise you to hear that, or is that something that the media sector is very much aware of?
I think the demand doesn't surprise me. I mean, you can clearly see the numbers that support women's sport. We've got 24 million people on Facebook looking at women's football accounts alone, 2 million on Instagram. I think for me, the democratization of being able to access content is the one thing that women's sport can ride, particularly where sports are not tied down to existing TV deals and they can open up different ways of consumption. If you look at the pay TV model, it basically values content in two ways, which is in terms of how many new subscriptions content can drive and how much advertising it brings with it. And both those numbers are built on historical data, which leads to a very conservative way of rights buying, with the money being heavily concentrated around only a few products in each market for pay TV, and I think increasingly only around a few products. Whereas the growth of streaming means real opportunity to develop new ways of accessing fans and spreading those strong storylines in a way that those whose rights are tightly controlled can't do. So, as a concrete example, we saw 140,000 people watch the women's NBA on Facebook last year, 20% of them outside the US. And you see that ability to really sort of grow beyond the barriers of how content has been controlled by pay TV in the last sort of 2 decades. And I think that's the real sort of hopeful message for women's sport, is that hopefully we can rise on the back of that tide and hit new audiences and achieve the profile that clearly the content has the demand for.
That's really interesting. And there's a lot I want to pick up on there. I think I'm going to be saying that a lot over the course of the next hour. But just to kind of take us back to the start of this maybe, and why it is so important why visibility is so important, why you need to see it to be it. And I'm curious, but perhaps Vika, you could come in on this. Curious as to who your role models were growing up and how important they were to you. Did you need to see it to believe that you could be it?
I'm sorry, I just lost you. You asked who are my role models were, and what was next?
Yeah, and how significant they were to you. Whether you feel now that it was important for you to be able to see it in order for you to be it.
Well, to be honest, from where I'm from, tennis was not really shown. When people ask me who did I watch growing up, it was very hard for me to answer because I haven't seen a lot of tennis on TV, and especially women's tennis. So I had to make a blueprint for myself and visualize of what I want to be and how I want to go about my career and what I want to achieve. So that was something that I've always been missing part of my come up, and now it's an interesting balance, because I feel like when there are young girls are watching me, is something that I want to be that representation, maybe inspiration for them to see what we are doing, to be inspired, because I was myself craving that opportunity. And I think everything that everybody just said was really interesting for me to hear, especially there's a huge demand for women's tennis, and the research obviously is there just to kind of show everybody. But I think from women's perspective, and especially from women's perspective as athletes, it's not surprising at all the difference of visibility that we do have. And I think that answering your question is seeing that opportunity in front of you is always going to make a huge difference for somebody who can try to relate or kind of try to want to grab that opportunity. And as I said, it is interesting for me that I kind of have that, but kind of always wanted to have that. And hopefully now we are seeing a lot of changes. And I think especially a country like Belarus is of a very small country without this, now having four players in top 100 girls, two guys, and keeps growing. So I think that really answers your point of see it and to be it. And I think moving forward, that direction of showing the examples is very valuable.
That's really interesting. Annika, what's your view on that? Because presumably you're now in the position that you're what other young girls have seen, but what did you have when you were coming through, and did you feel an absence of role models?
Well, growing up in Sweden, I mean, I think we're known for more equality to start with. Girls and boys play a lot together, a lot of mixed sports, but playing golf was a very a man-dominated sport. I mean, we didn't have the social media, we didn't have the coverage, we didn't have Golf Channel, certainly not where I grew up. So, it was only very few golfers, and it was golf magazines. And of course, on the cover would be male golfers. It would be the ones that Greg Norman and Ballesteros and Bernard Langer, a lot of Europeans, but not so much the superstars, not so much the Hall of Famers that we think of today, like Nancy Lopez or Bessie King. And the one that I kind of looked up was Liselott Norman. She won the US Open in 1988. She comes from a little town, a little club, just like I do. And all of a sudden she was on the front of the paper. I will just never forget that morning, because it made me dream. It made me think of, well, maybe I can do this. I mean, I've heard of her. I knew she played, but, for her to have that success that she did was really just really, really important. So I think nowadays, if you look at the young girls growing up, around the world, they have more access to at least see them. They might not be able to be around them, but I think it's really important to have the role models, because what they do is they make you show that it's possible. That they help you live your dream, and that's where it starts. It's all about what you see, so you can start thinking, and that's what I did. And it wasn't until I came to the U.S. when I visited an LPGA tournament where I could see these women hit balls. I could hear the noise. I could see the interaction with caddies. I could them out there playing, and that's what I needed to really take my career to the next level, and thinking, maybe one day I can do this on my own.
That's really interesting. Have any of you been particularly conscious throughout your careers of the difference how you've been portrayed compared to your male counterparts? I'm curious, because you're all coming from different sports and different backgrounds and at different times. I mean, Caroline, is that something you're particularly conscious of? Does it affect you?
Yeah, I'd say it affects me. I just think there's just such a difference in coverage. I would just say that because there's less coverage, the thing that's good about women's football is we are more accessible. So I think to engage people, we need to kind of show a little bit of ourselves a little bit more, and compared to the men's game, who are just so inaccessible, they're really in their own world, especially at a club like Man City. As much as we do things together, to get access to these players is quite tricky, and I think that's what the women's game is so unique, even not in COVID times, but chatting to fans after games, that never kind of happens in the men's game. So there's elements of the women's game that should definitely be celebrated, and I think that's what's so positive about it and what can set us apart instead of us always being compared. I think there's elements that should be celebrated a little bit more, and that's probably comes kind of is a reason for a difference in coverage at the same time.
That maybe ties in a little bit with what Peter was saying about actually, rather than necessarily just equality and achieving the same as men, women have a unique opportunity at the moment. And I think it's something that Angela touched upon as well in the previous panel about women's sports fans of women's sports being more digitally savvy, and out of necessity because of how women's sports has been available over the last 10 years. Peter, how in practice can that be capitalized upon?
I think if you look at the streams, if you look at the awareness of sport, I think it's really important that, first of all, you get the feeds out there, but also you promote and you engage them. And I think particularly athletes have got a huge role to play here. If you look at the social media accounts of the athletes, they're much more popular than sports organizations that in theory they're affiliated to. So I'd love to see athletes putting out feeds of their own games, of using their authentic voice around the games, because I think that's a really strong way of getting the message out that you've got great stories here, you've got great content here. The athletes themselves have got a big role to play in pushing this out if you believe that the content is going to be accessed through streams.
Does that pose any issues rights-wise? I mean, you've kind of got this transition period at the moment, haven't you, of the linear rights versus streaming, and we kind of all know what the future will look like, but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, it does pose problems, but I think that's why federations and organizations have got to really embrace the power of their own athletes and say that their best ambassadors, their best storytellers are the athletes themselves. And as a result, you think you need to try and get that mentality in place where you think, okay, if you've got a women's tennis player who has a strong following on Instagram and Facebook and on other social platforms, let's allow them to show the content of their own games, ideally live, but certainly in clip format, and to use the power of your biggest selling points, your athletes, as a way of really growing the sport.
That's really interesting. Vika, you've been on tour more than a decade now. Have you felt things change, and have you, with the rise in social media, have you felt empowered by that?
Well, I think social media is a two-edged sword. It is very beneficial in our days, but it also can create sometimes a wrong perception. And with the media, some of the media coverage, unfortunately, sometimes looking more for a story than actually telling a story. Like what it really is, and look forward is all about, unfortunately, too many times about the clickbait and the easy information access, and I think I've seen that a little bit more than I would love to see that, but at the same time, a lot of more individuals, what Peter was mentioning, are showing their personalities, their stories through their own channels, and I think that is super powerful, and I wish that we can, as athletes, look at this point to promote also our sport, because tennis is such an individual game, so it has a tendency of everybody thinking just about ourselves and how we want to get our endorsements and etc. But it's such an important step to give back to our sport, like especially Billie, built this huge platform for us to now benefit, and I think it's our time to build it back even further, not back, but build it even further. And I think that educating a lot of young players also with the new technology, and maybe some of the older players like me, how to use that in the better our sport to grow. Because if our sport grows, if their women's sport grows, we're all going to benefit. And I think that mentality is unfortunately missing a little bit in social media because it became so individual. But it is a great tool. I just hope that we all kind of use it in a more productive way and more inclusive way.
Well, look, social media can be a difficult place for women sometimes. How important, given all of everything Vika said there, how important is it that women are involved in women's storytelling, in telling women's stories? Chanda, you have transitioned to start working in the media now, so you have the perspective of an athlete and as somebody in the media. Do you think there need to be more women telling women's stories in the media?
Yeah, I think that would help. I think, one of the most important things in any space is to have varied perspectives, to have people with varied backgrounds and just different outlooks. And I think for women in particular, in many cases, our stories aren't told in the same way because men don't often think of all of the things we have to be conscious of, all of the things we have to consider. And especially as an athlete and making the transition, that's almost an afterthought, and then on the back end, it becomes, it becomes a story almost of surprise, like, oh, I didn't know you had to go through those things. I didn't know that was part of you had to consider. And I think when you have women involved in telling the stories, along with telling some of these stories, it elevates what you are putting out there. It elevates everything that you are able to say. And I think in particular, we look now at tennis and we look at the prevalence of moms out there, right? And that's sort of been, one of the big stories, and how well players can still do after having kids. And it seems almost like a surprise. Well, that's been happening for a long time. This is not new. It maybe isn't as prevalent, but it's not a new story. But all of a sudden we're hearing about it like it's a new development. And Vika is one of the prime examples of this. And I almost feel like as women, we have to fight against it and we have to keep proving these things when, it's already been done. We know we can do it. We know what's possible. So if we continue to have women involved in telling these stories, we will tell it in a different way. We will get a different perspective of it. And maybe at some point we can move past it, because when we talk about men athletes and men's tennis players in particular, we don't focus as much on family and the fact that they have kids and, they're married. Sometimes we don't even know. But for women, that becomes the big story because it feels new. It feels different. It feels like something that's a huge hurdle. And I would love for us to get past that. I would love for it to just be part of normal conversations, but not this hurdle that you're doing well in spite of, having a family, in spite of having kids. Let's talk about how women have been amazing for a long time, have been fulfilling multiple roles and continue to do so, and just have that be an augment to the story.
Yeah, gosh, that's so interesting. Annika, you've got those varying perspectives as well, sort of the journey from being an athlete, the commercial side of things, and now involved in the sports governance. How have those differing experiences caused your views of gender representation to evolve and change over the course of your career?
Well, I would say that it's very important to go through all these phases. Just growing up playing, I really didn't think of the gender so much. I mean, I was a golfer. I wanted to play, and I practiced with boys growing up. And, I probably did that because there was not that many girls playing. And then, when I stepped into the professional arena, I realized that it's just a very small space, a very, very small space. It wasn't until I started really to do very well, to win tournaments, when I shot 59 in 2001. And then when I started to play with the men in 2003, when I did that one event and then some other game and so forth, I felt like all of a sudden, I was on the radar. And from a commercial standpoint, that certainly helped me. And I think that's the biggest thing we see nowadays. A lot of women can't even get into that space. And I think that's what Billie Jean King said, follow the money, there is money. And I think it's been here too, is we just have to somehow, figure out how, we got to reverse some of the spending to other places because it's there and there's so many stories to tell. And obviously now with this new role, more of a governance perspective, it's, I'm new to it. So I'm just sitting here like a bogey president in a way that I'm, just learning along the way. But I mean, there's certainly an underrepresentation of women. And, why is it changing now? Is it because they just feel like we need to, or is it because we really feel like women have, the confidence and the competence to do it? And I feel like we do. And I think, I put my name out there, and I feel like you have to work so hard to get there. But once you're in there, realize, hey, you can really add something. So I think it's an awakening call for a lot of people, not just because of that you have to, but really we contribute. We have, the ideas that women have as far as just perspective of things, whether it's tournament, logistics, everything. I mean, it's good to have diversity. So I feel like, the IGF, which is kind of the role that I have, we're following the IOC, and I think they've made some great progress when, bringing women in and so forth, and really trying to do it more equal. And I think other federations needs to follow that. And certainly my role now is to make sure that golf is one of them. I mean, I'm lucky a little bit like tennis that we have a little more exposure than some other sports, but still, we gotta go out there and continue to work hard, to continue to push it. And I think we make a difference. I'm going to see, hey, this is something that we should have done for a long time, and it shouldn't be an afterthought, which I think, I think it was Shanda said on the call, it should just be part of it. And that to me is what's more annoying to anything. It's like, hey, we're part of this. We shouldn't be an afterthought.
Yeah, well, how about that relationship with the commercial side of things? And I'm fascinated by everything Billie Jean had to say about that side of things. Follow the money. She couldn't have been more clear about that. But how, Peter, do we break that chicken and egg cycle? Billie Jean said, give us 50% of revenues and see what we can do with it. I mean, realistically, that's not going to happen overnight. But what levers can be pulled on the commercial side of things to build those sponsorship, advertising, broadcasting revenues for women's sport?
I think one of the things that Angela talked about in the previous panel I'd pick out, which is having the confidence to say you can market the women's game on its own. And, you look at, for example, thing like FIFA and the way that women's football is sold with men's football. And it means that you have broadcasters and sponsors who effectively have bought in largely because of the men's game. And that means they don't necessarily activate behind the stories in the same way. Their sponsorship budgets are not designed to be around the Women's World Cup, for example. And I think there are elements there where you can unlock the power of women's sport by saying, have the confidence to stand on your own 2 feet commercially, and have people buy into the sport that really want to activate behind the sport. Women's football is at such a great position at the moment where it's really rising this sort of tide of enthusiasm and popularity. Let's get sponsors in who really want to support women's sport, as opposed to people who are in because they're buying the men's game and they get tagged into the women's game. I think there's definitely potential there to sort of open up the possibilities. And I think Angela Ruggiero is at the forefront of these sort of conversations where she sees where commercial potential is, where the venture capital money wants to flow, and hopefully that can unlock sort of some of the power of the women's games.
That's really interesting. I mean, because that is that advice to stand on your own 2 feet and take the leap of faith. That's maybe at odds with the direction of travel in tennis, which is kind of more combination between the men's and women's tours.
And I think, it's not necessarily one easy answer fits all sports, but I think you have to look at where your commercial potential is, where you can maximize. And, I think there are certain sports where you would try and bring things together under one roof. There are certain sports where you think, actually, no, the momentum is in the favor of the women's game here, and we can do a lot more if you unlock that potential.
So rather than follow the money, you take the leap and let the money follow you.
I think if you see the underlying data, if you see the trends being there that you can ride on, then it's the right time. So, you've got to do your research first and be clear that you're going in the direction. But I think there's not a necessity to say, let's automatically bundle ourselves in with men's sport every time.
Do you feel that, Vika? Do you feel like now is a moment when women can be brave and take that leap, and women's sport, women's tennis can stand on its own 2 feet increasingly?
I think women are brave. I don't think it's a time to be brave. I think we've always been brave. Uh, Starting from Billie Jean King, with Original Nine, I think couldn't be more brave than they have been. I think the opportunity now is just giving us a little bit more, maybe that belief in women's sport. And I think right now it's changing. I think the pandemic is also showing a little bit of a different side of the men's game versus women's game, and the professional of it is on all levels. And I think it's just now is a good opportunity for us to maybe capitalize a little bit more on that opportunity. But on a global aspect of sport, I think we should always think about how we move the business forward instead of only thinking about to save what we have right now. And I think that's why I'm personally so inspired by Billie Jean King. She took that leap of faith into a new direction. And I think we, as players, shouldn't be afraid to take also a step in a new direction where the world is changing. So that's what I'm hoping is going to happen in our sport. I truly believe that we have an incredible product. We just also, as athletes and people who are involved in tennis, should think more forward and not stay in the conservative way as we have been.
And we have seen that over the past 12 months, haven't we? As the world's changed, it has tended to be, in tennis at least, the female players that have been more outspoken and have been braver. And Chanda, you touched upon this earlier in the research findings, with Black Lives Matter and race and activism coming to the forefront. It's been really notable that it's been the women that have been far more outspoken than the men on that. And that's very much reflected in the research. Why do you think that might be?
I think a lot of it may be just the moment, maybe the opportunity. I mean, I touched on the fact that, there are several women at top of the women's game in tennis that, are women of color. And so the opportunity is there. And you compare that to the men, and it's not quite the same, from, Serena to Naomi Osaka, as I mentioned, Coco Gauff, who, has had a lot of attention on her, although she isn't at the top of the game just yet, and still Venus Williams, who is very much a force in tennis. And I think because of where these women are uniquely situated, it has been an opportunity, and they've stepped up and embraced it. And as Vika said, as women, we have had to constantly, be brave. We have to kind of go into uncharted territories. And I think it's that mindset that women have, combined with the moment, combined with, just where they feel they are mentally, in terms of the social landscape. And it's been fantastic. We have benefited from them being brave enough to step up and speak out. So maybe not the norm, but in tennis, we see it a little more often as an individual sport. And, I think it's interesting, to me, when you consider, just the space that women are in relative to men. And in trying to get more of the market share, I think tennis is a great example, because in the biggest events, we play side by side with the men. And yet it's still, in some cases, thought of as women hanging on to men's coattails, women trying to get in there on the backs of men. And I just wish that conversation, would change, because women bring something very unique to the sport. And, I can't tell you how many times I've kind of gotten into a conversation. The gist of it is women play a different. I mean, it's incredible to me that the concept of that. It is the same sport. I remember as a young broadcaster, I was asked, can you commentate a men's match? And I thought that was such an odd question, because I said, isn't it tennis? Yes, I can do it. So I think as we start to change the thought process surrounding this, it's not women trying to benefit when they don't deserve it off of men's hard work. It is women bringing something unique to the table, something unique to the conversation that in some cases people can more clearly connect with. And we've got to embrace it from that perspective, as opposed to, there being competing forces and, women aren't standing on their own versus men. We play sport together. And the beauty of sport is that you've got everybody playing and it's a level playing field. And I think we've got to keep pushing that narrative more and more.
If you have any questions, by the way, do send them in via the questions button on the right-hand side of the panel. We will have a bit of time for those at the end. I wanted to, Caroline, pick up with you on men allies, because you have been mentored by Andy Murray since becoming part of his management team. And Andy is such a strong male advocate for gender equality, one of the strongest that we have. How important do you think it is to have those male allies, to have men's buy-in into this cause, and to have their understanding that gender equality is a positive all and not just for women?
Yeah, it's hugely important, and Andy is probably the best out there at the moment. And yeah, it goes such a long way when he, makes his argument for gender equality, whatever it is, or a comment in a press conference. I think he's leading the way in that sense. I don't think we see it enough in football. I think it's tricky for football players, I think, but even just the odd tweet, it really helps. It puts women football on the map again, and it gets people talking. I think a lot of the time, obviously, Andy had a female coach, and that's when he really realised it. And I think until people are actually affected by it, that people don't necessarily kind of are maybe proactive about it. See, sometimes when the guys maybe have a daughter and who's interested in football, that's maybe when it sparks the conversation and gets them talking about it, and a bit more interested in how the women's team works and things like that. So it's hugely important, and the more high profile, not even high profile, men that we can get on board and kind of help us go towards a common goal is so important, and really helps all sports, all women's sports. And I think it'd be great to have more males kind of doing similar to what Andy does on a regular basis.
And I know you do a lot of work to get women better represented, not just on the pitch, but also in coaching and administrative positions, and that's, Annika, obviously something that you focus a lot on as well. How important is it that we focus, if we are to change the language and the way that women's sports are covered, the volume of coverage that they get, how important is it that we look at those administrative positions, the leadership roles, and ensure that women are represented there? Absolutely.
I think there's so much room, and I just think of the things that we do with my foundation. A lot of people think that we're just a feeder to the professional tour. I mean, we have over 600 girls every year that play in our events, but so much more than just playing professional golf, as you know, and in other sports too. Like you mentioned, administrative and whether it's tournaments, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's just rules officials. I mean, the list goes on. I mean, we all know what it takes to put a golf tournament together. There's so many things, and we don't have the women there. It seems like, okay, I didn't make it as a professional, so maybe I go back to college and pursue that. So we try to encourage them that there's a lot to do. And it was funny, I giggled a little bit when Shanda was talking about, can you call a sport? And it's sad that, they would even ask that question, but it's true. And it makes me think about golf course design. And, that's such a male dominated, area. I mean, very, very few women have been able to put different there. I've been lucky to design a few, but I'll never forget the first few times I put my name in the ring and they looked at me and like, oh, is this course going to be really short and really easy? That's the first comment they have. And I always tell them, I play from the back, I play you anywhere, and we can have this discussion. So, we understand the sport as much as anybody. We appreciate the sport and we understand the history. So it's just changing some of these people's minds. So therefore, by having women in these different roles, can make such a big difference. So I think it takes time to change, but just opening it up and giving these women a chance to try, they're gonna be successful and strive. So it's just keep on pushing, keep opening doors, and we have to empower each other. We have to tell them this is going on. I think a lot of athletes always feel like when they're done with their sport, they don't think that they're good at anything else. I think that's the biggest thing, is especially a lot of women, they're like, well, what else can I do? Can I just have a family and that's about it? There's so much to offer. And I know that in golf, I always tell that golf is so similar to life. All the things you need in life is what I got from golf. So It's just kind of fun to see that parallel, and hopefully we can work together.
Peter, why do non-gendered search engines searches show men's tennis first, and how do we change that? How do we improve search engine optimization for women's sport?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's clearly more of a Google question than a Facebook question, but I'll do my best to answer on the behalf of neighbours.
You're the closest we've got, Peter.
Yeah, it's not far away down the road. And I think if you look at what search engines do, they basically reflect society. That's how they're supposed to operate. So if you're going to change them, you have to change them one of two ways, which is either manually or it's by changing the data that's going into them, which is clearly the preferred option around here. And I think for a good reason, because if you manually change search engines, then you open yourself up to other accusations of bias as well. So the important thing is to have more women's stories out there, because that's going to affect those search engines, and it's going to affect the way that women surface in the search engines. And as a result, I think the importance is encouraging organizations, individuals, federations to put out more stories, to encourage the media outlets to put out more stories, and that inevitably will change the search results going forward. I saw in the report, the way that if you look for top tennis players in Google, it clearly, the first page is hugely male dominated, and it basically gets better second, third, fourth page. If you do the same on Facebook, again, not ideal, but it takes you more into sort of tennis playing communities and tennis broadcasters and tennis environment. And the important way of changing it is by saying, okay, how do we surface more positive tennis stories about women's players generally? And that then should reflect in those search results going forward. So again, long term, you see as a solution that should inevitably happen, that the more positive stories that are out there, that will reflect back in search. That doesn't solve the short-term problem that if you go in now and search top tennis players, you're going to get a heavily male profiled list. I'd say for context, that's very similar to other industries. If you look at film directors, you're going to end up with a heavily male skewed list because of what is perceived as the historical performance of male directors in winning Oscars, for example. So it's not unique to tennis, but the solution is more about, okay, what input can you put in that then reflects in search going forward? And the more strong women's stories that are out there, that will gradually solve it. There is potentially a role there for manual curation, and that's down to the individuals that run each individual platform. But the long-term solution is algorithmic.
I mean, there's so much to get into there. We don't have the time to get into all of it, but I mean, obviously, in an ideal world, you change society, and then, as you said, search engine results are a reflection of society, and those would change in turn. But how do we change this perception, this default conscious bias of women's sport as niche or other, men's sport being the default, and women's sport, as Chanda said, as if it's this niche, you can only commentate on that thing? I don't know if anybody wants to put their hand up to tackle this question, big one, but how do we take that on? Chanda's nodding. Come on, Chanda.
I wanted to
Vika, yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if I'm going to answer this particular question, but I just wanted to kind of make a comment what Peter just said. And historically, when we do look at women's game, we have numbers of very heavy trophy collection of a lot of women, players compared to movie directors, for example. So the one of the part that is sometimes a little bit frustrating when we hear in our sport in particular that we women champions with incredible stories, with incredible achievements that are still do not get recognized. So either we continue to just talk more about more stories and more stories. But I think if we look in a really long period of time, we have that consistency of remarkable champions. For some reason, it does not change the conversation yet. So I think that there's a little bit of a bigger question here. Why is that conversation not changing? And I think with new generation where, gender maybe is not such a huge focus. I think that's more of a conservative way looking back years of history that what women supposed to do versus what we are actually doing. I think that conversation is slowly is changing, and going back to what Chanda was saying about a conversation about being a mother. I felt since I came back, the only reason why I'm a tour is I'm a mother of the tour, and I'm not. And people are talking to me like, "Oh, you're a mom." I said, "You have no idea how I am as a mom. The only person who knows who I am as a mom is my family and my son, because I'm a mom to him. I'm not the mom to journalists. I'm not the mom to people at the tournament." So that conversation is still so old and so conservative. And the tennis, in one way, is unfortunate that it is so conservative, where we are so afraid of breaking any tradition. And I think that's why we have a lot of people who are still watching tennis are those, conservative, because they're so used to the same kind of demographics, same principles, same traditions. And that's what my hope and my will is to really change that understanding of tennis as well. And I think that kind of maybe comes with other sports as well. And just my comment from my personal experience for Caroline, I've spoken to 3 presidents of football clubs, and they couldn't be more happier with their women's team. They said they're the most pleasant people to work with. They have amazing experiences. And it's not to say versus men, it's just I would love to highlight those parts. For me, it was amazing to hear. I was super proud. And I don't know any of the players, I don't know anybody of those clubs, but I was so excited to hear that part of the story. And I think if those maybe from men's side come out more, not me saying this, but people are accepting that's okay that women are better at something, and not better than men. They're just good. Let's just not say better. They're just good. And I think that also changes a little bit that conversation.
Victoria can pick up on that. I think, it's exactly right that the strength of the women stories are there historically. The problem is that those were not reflected in the media in the same way as the men's stories. And that reflects itself in the search engine results. And, you end up in a cycle that the search engines are perhaps a mirror on the lack of recognition for women's sports historically, as opposed to sort of a way of solving it as it stands.
So is it time then to try and focus on appealing to a new audience rather than that older audience, as Vika said, that is more conservative, not abandoning them, but turning attention to appealing to a new audience? We've actually got a question here that's come in from Jay Stewart. Do women's sport need male audiences to be commercially successful? Does it matter if men are interested? Women are 50% of the market and 50% of the spending power. Peter, what do you think?
It's not a necessity, but it's an attraction, right? The more audience there is, the better, and that doesn't need to be a male audience or a female audience. It just needs to be a bigger audience. So absolutely, you can have a strong audience for women's in a women-only fan base, but the bigger the fan base, the better. And I think, the strength of the stories, the quality of the play is such that it shouldn't just be a women audience. It clearly is attractive to both. Again, I'd go to sort of Caroline and the support that women's football has got in the UK, and a generation of fans that are coming up saying, I'm a Man City supporter, women, men, whatever, and I'll support that team. And that's really encouraged, because there's an age group there that don't have the same perception of women's football and can take the joy in it for what it is.
Do you feel that, Caroline, since those rights deals have been done and since the visibility of women's football has been elevated, have you felt things change for you tangibly?
Yeah, I think so. I think the last kind of 4 or 5 years, the momentum of the women's game, it's reached levels that I didn't necessarily think would happen even a few years ago. And I think he makes a great point. It is about it not so much being men's football, women's football. It's just it's all inclusive, and when people describe it as men's or women's, it always then gets compared. And I think at the end of the day, it's the same sport. Yes, there might be differences, but I think it's important that that's the whole visualization thing. So as much as we want young girls to see women kicking, playing football, playing tennis, whatever it is, I think it's also important young boys see it as well, so they grow up and it becomes a conversation, normal for women to be playing football. And I think that takes time, obviously. Women's football was banned, so we are playing catch up. That also has to be remembered. Men's football is kind of in a world of its own at the moment, but it takes time, and I do think that's like a huge point and important that you have a fan of a club that's a fan of both the men's and women's team. It doesn't really matter.
Chanda, what do you think about that, working as you do now in the Mirror, about trying to appeal to a new kind of audience, a less conservative audience, a more open-minded audience, one that is woke or whatever you want to call it, and more embracing of women's stories?
I'm having a little trouble with my internet, so you cut out, Catherine. Can you repeat what
I just wondered, on your perspective, just picking up on everything that's been said from the last few speakers about trying to appeal to a new kind of audience, perhaps a younger audience, but a less conservative, more open-minded, an audience that's more embracing of women's stories.
I think, just in listening to all of the conversations and in my capacity now as broadcaster commentator, it gets me thinking, and thinking about how to tell more of the stories of how women get to the places they get to in their sport. How do they rise to the top? How do they train? How to make their decisions, in terms of improving their craft, improving their sport, improving their bodies. I mean, for me, those are really interesting stories. And every now and then we get to touch on it with women, the way we do more with the men. But some of those stories just aren't out there. Women aren't maybe putting it out there as much, and we're not, asking those questions on the broadcast side.
I think we might have lost Chanda. Might come back. I hope she does come back, because I do have one more question for all of you, actually. Oh, Chanda's back.
Yes, I keep pausing, and I'm like chomping at the bit because I to get it there. So I apologize if the internet is going haywire. But, as I said, I would love to be a part of changing and just including more of those stories. Even while I'm commentating a match, I try to focus more on, what's happening on the court, what's happening with the tennis, how are these women showcasing their high level of skill versus, sometimes the gossipy stories and the things about, everything that's happening in their personal lives, and for me, that's one part of it. That's one step. But the other step is just to keep putting those stories out about how women push through the adversity that every athlete has to deal with, that every athlete has to contend with, on how to improve, how to get better, and how to be themselves out there in competition. And so I would, hopefully can continue to do that.
I have one more question for all of you. And it's sort of looking at more of the concrete ways that we can look to make change, something that people can go away with and think, right, that would be a good thing to happen. If we were to create a manifesto for change, much like Billie Jean did back in the early 70s, and you could each implement one action point, what would that be? Annika?
Well, I would say it's the panel, see it to be it. I think it's really important to do, do what you're promoting others people to do. And that's the best testimony you can get, is to be in there and do it. I mean, I believe in the cause that I have, so I continue to do it, and hopefully others will follow. I think that's a true way to do it. I mean, leaders got to do what they say, otherwise it doesn't give you credibility. So that would be my my few cents is do what you believe.
Caroline?
Yeah, I think for me it's all about see it to be, and I think for that we need the exposure. I think it would be kind of like media just coming together. I'm not exactly sure what this looks like, but coming together to promote women's sport, get it on TV, and just increase the exposure across women's sport.
Vika?
I would actually add just to all of what's been said already. See to be it is a perfect slogan for that. But I would say also that people say a lot of things but don't sometimes meet them with actions, and I would love for people who do speak out loud and make comments, make statements, etc. with what they're saying. And I think that would really make a bigger difference. And for myself, I believe that I have a responsibility of also showing by my actions, not just by my words.
Chandra, I'm going to come to you while your internet is holding out.
In LA, everyone is waking up and logging on. That's going to be my story. But I would love to see women continue to tell their stories and not be afraid. Not be afraid to speak from our perspectives and have it feel like it's a weakness somehow. Support each other, encourage each other in those ways, while we look to put more women in positions behind the scenes, in production, and in social media, in these different companies that have influence, in different areas of sponsorship that have influence and that can move the conversation, can move the needle even further.
Peter?
I'm going to go something more concrete, but building on what Chandra just said, I think that the biggest change that we need to do is look at hiring processes and look at how we get people into senior decision-making roles, and that goes all the way from entry level up to senior decisions, and trying to make sure that the hiring processes are structured and that the people who are making the decisions reflect the audience that they're trying to talk to, and not just the people who are already in the industry. I think the easiest hire, and I've seen it for years and years through broadcasting, is you hire someone who's recommended by someone And that is clearly not the right answer. You need paid internships so that people who come in are not necessarily a wealthy background. You need a decision-making process on each hire, which is structured and clearly gets the right person for the job. And as a result, you will see women's talent rise. But I think every organization within the sports world, whether that broadcasters, social media companies, federations, needs to look at those hiring process and make sure that the right person is being hired, and not just someone who reflects the bias of the person who's doing the hiring.
That's really interesting. There's so much to chew on there. Thank you all so much for being part of the discussion today. I hope it's the first step on a road to real change, because I think between us we do have the power to make a difference and make a statement in the world. And I hope you feel energized like I do to try and see that into fruition. So thank you all very much indeed for being part of the debate today. It all counts and it all matters. And thank you all for being here today, for being a part of this event. It's been a tremendous success from my perspective, really enjoyable, such meaty discussion. Thank you to the Foundation for Global Sports Development, the sponsor for the event, and for ITF's Advantage All Gender Equality Strategy, that, as you heard about more earlier, designed to empower, inspire and enable women and girls to reach their full potential on and off the court. Thank you once again to BNP Paribas, our event partner today, but also the title sponsor for the Billie Jean King Cup by BNP Paribas. And best of luck to all the nations competing in the playoffs this weekend. Thank you to Billie Jean King and all of our panelists today. And most of all, thank you to you for being here, because between us we have the power to actually change things, and this is how change starts. So I hope it has been as useful to you as it feels to me. So that just about brings to a close the formal proceedings, but I do urge you to continue the discussion if you'd like to via our breakout sessions. To join a table, just click on one of the virtual chairs to enter. It's really easy, and there's plenty of interesting discussions going on off the back of all of this. So thanks once again, and good luck for what I hope will be a more gender equal future.